The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Sterling Industries overlooked a Manhattan skyline that seemed to pulse with ambition and possibility. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city in all its chaotic glory, while inside, 12 leather chairs surrounded a mahogany table polished to mirror brightness. The quarterly board meeting had been called for 9 a.m. sharp, and everyone knew that punctuality at Sterling wasn't a suggestion. It was a commandment issued from on high by CEO Marcus Sterling himself. I adjusted my tablet as I took my seat halfway down the table, my position as Senior Operations Manager, granting me observer status rather than voting authority. After 8 years with the company, I had attended enough of these meetings to recognize the subtle power dynamics at play. Who spoke first, who deferred to whom, who controlled the narrative that would ultimately determine Sterling's strategic direction. The board members filed in with their usual mixture of corporate gravitas and barely concealed impatience. These were titans of industry, former government officials, and financial powerhouses whose time was measured in billions rather than minutes. They served on Sterling's board not for the modest compensation, but for the prestige and networking opportunities that came with association to one of America's most influential technology companies. CFO Patricia Walsh entered last, her trademark confident stride and perfectly pressed suit, projecting the competence that had earned her Marcus Sterling's trust over the past 3 years. She carried herself with the assurance of someone who controlled information that others desperately wanted to understand. The financial health of a company whose stock price influenced entire market sectors. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus began once we were all seated, his voice carrying the authority that had built Sterling Industries from a startup in his garage to a multinational corporation worth over $15 billion. "Patricia has some encouraging news about our quarterly performance that I think you'll find reassuring given recent market volatility. The setup was perfect. Executive confidence, boardroom prestige, the promise of good news in uncertain times." Patricia stood, her presentation materials arranged with characteristic precision, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she prepared to deliver what everyone expected would be another confirmation of Sterling's exceptional management and continued growth. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice projecting across the room with practiced authority, "I'm pleased to report that despite challenging market conditions and increased competitive pressure, Sterling Industries remains fundamentally stable. Our cash flows are strong, our operational efficiency continues to improve, and our projected earnings for the fiscal year exceed analyst expectations by approximately 12%. The words hung in the air with the weight of professional authority and boardroom tradition. Murmurs of approval circled the table as directors absorbed this latest confirmation that their association with Sterling continued to be both profitable and prestigious. Then, the conference room door opened, and everything changed. The man who entered wasn't part of the usual Sterling Industries inner circle. Middle-aged with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried a worn leather briefcase and moved with the deliberate precision of someone accustomed to delivering uncomfortable truths to powerful people. His presence in the boardroom, unannounced and clearly unexpected, created an immediate shift in atmosphere from corporate satisfaction to wary attention. Marcus Sterling's expression darkened as he recognized the intruder. "Mr. Thompson, this is a private board meeting. Whatever audit questions you have can be addressed through proper channels after we conclude our business." Robert Thompson, I realized with a chill of recognition. The independent auditor hired by the SEC as part of their routine investigation into Sterling's recent acquisition activities. His appearance here, during Patricia's presentation of financial stability, suggested timing that was either remarkably coincidental or deliberately orchestrated. "I apologize for the interruption," Thompson replied, his voice carrying the neutral professionalism of someone who had delivered unwelcome news to hostile audiences before. "However, the Securities and Exchange Commission has instructed me to present my findings immediately to Sterling's board of directors, given the material nature of the discrepancies I've discovered." Discrepancies. The word fell into the boardroom, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of unease through directors who had just been assured of the company's financial health. Patricia had gone very pale, her earlier confidence evaporating as Thompson approached the presentation screen with his own laptop. "Mr. Thompson, Any audit findings should be reviewed first with management to ensure accuracy and context before presentation to the board. Under normal circumstances, yes, Thompson agreed, connecting his computer to the room's display system with practiced efficiency. However, when audit findings suggest potential securities fraud, immediate disclosure to board members becomes a regulatory requirement rather than a professional courtesy. Securities fraud. The phrase electrified the room, board members exchanging sharp glances as the implications of Thompson's presence began to register. This wasn't a routine audit review, but potentially a criminal investigation unfolding in real time. The financial statements presented to this board over the past 18 months, Thompson continued, his first slide displaying Sterling's official quarterly reports in stark black and white, contained significant misrepresentations regarding revenue recognition, asset valuation, and debt obligations. Patricia gripped the back of her chair, knuckles white against the dark leather. This is highly inappropriate, Mr. Thompson. Audit findings require proper context and explanation, which I'm prepared to provide, Thompson interrupted smoothly, advancing to his next slide. Beginning with the revenue recognition practices that have artificially inflated Sterling's reported earnings by approximately 40% over the past year. The number hit the boardroom like a physical blow. 40% artificial inflation. Not minor accounting discrepancies, but systematic misrepresentation that would require massive restatements and potentially trigger investigations by multiple regulatory agencies. Marcus Sterling stood slowly, his famous composure cracking as he attempted to maintain control of a situation spiraling beyond his authority. Mr. Thompson, I must insist that you cease this presentation immediately. Any audit concerns should be addressed through proper procedures. The proper procedure for potential securities fraud is immediate disclosure to the board of directors, Thompson replied, his tone remaining professionally neutral despite the escalating tension. Which is what I'm providing through this presentation. He clicked to the next slide, revealing a comparison between Sterling's reported cash flows and the actual bank records obtained through the SEC's investigative authority. The discrepancies were staggering. Reported cash reserves of over $2 billion versus actual liquid assets of less than $400 million. Where's the money, Patricia? Asked board member Sarah Chen, her voice tight with controlled anger as she studied the damning figures. If these numbers are accurate, Sterling Industries is technically insolvent despite your reports of record profitability. Patricia's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her carefully constructed professional facade completely destroyed by evidence she clearly hadn't expected to be revealed in this forum. Around the table, board members were reaching for their phones, calculating personal liability and reputational damage from association with what was beginning to look like one of the largest corporate frauds in recent memory. The money has been systematically diverted through shell companies and offshore accounts, Thompson continued, displaying a complex organizational chart showing the flow of Sterling funds through an intricate network of subsidiary entities. Some of these diversions appear to have been authorized at the highest levels of corporate management. This final revelation, that the fraud likely extended beyond Patricia's financial manipulations to include approval from senior executives, completed the boardroom's transformation from comfortable quarterly review to criminal investigation. The stability Patricia had announced just minutes earlier had been revealed as an elaborate fiction, maintained through accounting manipulation that threatened not just Sterling's future, but the personal and professional reputations of everyone associated with its governance. As Thompson continued his methodical presentation of evidence that would undoubtedly trigger immediate regulatory action and criminal investigations, I observed the collapse of professional relationships and institutional trust that had taken years to build. The CFO's confident announcement had preceded by minutes the most devastating revelation in Sterling Industries' corporate history. A timing so perfectly ironic, it seemed orchestrated by forces beyond human planning. The auditor's real numbers had shattered more than financial illusions. They had exposed the criminal corruption at the heart of a company that thousands of employees and millions of investors had trusted with their futures. The board meeting that had begun with assurances of stability had become the catalyst for what would likely be one of the most significant corporate scandals of the decade. The 20 minutes following Thompson's presentation passed in a blur of urgent phone calls, whispered consultations, and the controlled panic that accompanies the real-time collapse of everything previously believed stable and secure. Board members huddled with their personal attorneys, trying to assess potential liability from their association with what was clearly systematic fraud. Patricia had been escorted from the building by federal agents who had appeared with remarkable speed, as if they had been waiting nearby for Thompson's signal. Marcus Sterling remained at the head of the table, his legendary composure hanging by a thread, as he attempted to manage a crisis that threatened to destroy both his company and his personal legacy. The man who had been celebrated as a visionary leader and innovative entrepreneur was now facing the possibility that his empire had been built on criminal deception that extended far beyond his knowledge or control. "How long has this been going on?" demanded board member William Harrison, his investment firm's reputation now tied to potential association with securities fraud. "And how did our due diligence miss discrepancies of this magnitude?" Thompson, who had remained in the room despite completing his formal presentation, consulted his documentation before responding. The fraudulent practices appear to have begun approximately 3 years ago, initially as minor accounting adjustments to smooth quarterly earnings. The manipulation escalated systematically as the company faced increasing pressure to maintain growth rates that exceeded actual operational performance. 3 years. The timeline coincided with Patricia's promotion to CFO and her implementation of innovative financial management approaches that had been praised by analysts for their sophistication and strategic thinking. What had been celebrated as advanced financial engineering was now revealed as criminal manipulation designed to conceal fundamental business problems. "Where was internal audit during this period?" asked Dr. Elizabeth Carter, whose background in corporate governance had made her particularly focused on oversight mechanisms designed to prevent exactly this type of fraud. "Internal audit reports were systematically modified before board presentation," Thompson replied, displaying emails between Patricia and her staff that showed deliberate suppression of concerns raised by junior auditors. When internal auditors questioned specific practices, they were either reassigned to different responsibilities or terminated for performance issues. This revelation explained the turnover in Sterling's financial departments that several board members had questioned during previous meetings. What had been presented as natural staffing optimization was actually the elimination of potential whistleblowers who might have exposed the fraud before it reached catastrophic proportions. "What's our legal exposure?" Marcus asked, his voice strained as he faced the possibility that his life's work might be destroyed by criminal activity conducted in his name but apparently without his knowledge. "That depends on several factors," Thompson replied diplomatically. "The extent of senior management awareness, the timeline of discovery and response, the cooperation provided with ongoing investigations, all will influence how regulatory agencies and prosecutors approach potential charges." The implicit message was clear. Marcus's own legal jeopardy would be determined by his response to these revelations and his willingness to cooperate with investigations that would inevitably expose every aspect of Sterling's operations to scrutiny. "I want complete transparency," Marcus declared, his voice regaining some of its usual authority. "Full cooperation with all investigations, immediate implementation of enhanced financial controls, and public disclosure of the situation once legal counsel determines appropriate timing." This commitment to radical transparency represented either principled leadership or strategic positioning, acknowledging that cooperation might provide the best path through the crisis while demonstrating commitment to reform that could potentially preserve both personal and corporate reputation. That approach will require comprehensive reorganization of financial management and probably significant workforce reductions, warned board member Thomas Mitchell, whose experience with corporate restructuring provided grim insight into the practical implications of Thompson's revelations. As the meeting devolved into urgent discussions about damage control, legal strategy, and immediate operational challenges, I found myself observing the destruction of assumptions that had seemed unshakable just hours earlier. The company where I had built my career, the colleagues I had respected, the financial stability I had counted on for retirement planning, all had been revealed as elaborate fiction maintained through criminal deception. Yet beneath the shock and uncertainty, I felt something unexpected: relief. The growing sense over recent months that something fundamental was wrong with Sterling's operations. Discrepancies in operational reports, questions from concerned subordinates that had been dismissed without adequate explanation. Pressure to present optimistic projections that didn't align with actual performance had been validated by Thompson's systematic exposure of underlying fraud. The real numbers had finally been revealed, and while their immediate implications were devastating, they provided a foundation of truth upon which genuine stability might eventually be rebuilt. Patricia's false announcement of financial health had been replaced by evidence-based assessment that would guide decision-making according to actual conditions rather than maintained illusions. The emergency shareholders meeting convened exactly 1 week after Thompson's devastating board presentation, with Sterling Industries' main auditorium packed beyond capacity as investors, employees, and media representatives gathered to hear Marcus's official response to the fraud revelations. The atmosphere was electric with tension and barely contained anger from shareholders who had watched their investments lose 60% of their value as news of the scandal spread through financial markets. I sat in the front section reserved for senior staff, my operations manager position giving me a clear view of the proceedings while leaving me technically separate from the executives who faced potential criminal liability. The past week had been surreal. Federal investigators occupying our offices, employee interviews conducted under attorney supervision, and the gradual revelation that Patricia's fraud had extended far beyond accounting manipulation to include creation of entirely fictional business units and revenue streams. Before addressing questions about recent revelations, Marcus began, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium through speakers that amplified every nuance of strain and determination. I want to provide complete transparency about what we've discovered and what steps we're taking to address it. His presentation was methodical and unsparing, acknowledging the scope of financial manipulation, accepting responsibility for oversight failures, and outlining a comprehensive restructuring plan designed to restore both operational integrity and investor confidence. The man who had built Sterling through entrepreneurial vision was now demonstrating crisis leadership that impressed even his harshest critics. The fraud was sophisticated and systematic, Marcus explained, his slides showing the complex network of shell companies and fictitious contracts that had hidden Sterling's actual financial condition. However, our core business operations remain sound. The technology we develop, the services we provide, and the client relationships we've built over 2 decades continue to generate legitimate value and revenue. This distinction between fraudulent financial reporting and actual business performance became crucial as Marcus outlined the survival strategy he had developed with the crisis management team assembled over the past week. Sterling Industries could potentially weather the scandal if stakeholders focused on underlying operational value rather than the manipulated financial presentations that had artificially inflated its apparent worth. We're implementing immediate reforms to prevent any recurrence of these practices, Marcus continued, introducing the new financial oversight structure that would include independent monitors, enhanced audit procedures, and whistleblower protections designed to encourage early detection of problems. Additionally, we're establishing a victim compensation fund to address financial harm caused by the fraudulent information provided to investors and employees. The compensation fund represented Marcus's attempt to accept moral responsibility even for criminal activity conducted without his knowledge or authorization. A gesture that began to shift audience sentiment from pure anger toward cautious appreciation for leadership that prioritized accountability over damage control. Questions? Marcus invited, though his expression suggested he was prepared for hostile interrogation rather than friendly inquiry. The first shareholder to speak was Janet Morrison, whose pension fund held substantial Sterling stock. Mr. Sterling, how can investors have confidence in any financial information provided by this company going forward? Trust, once broken on this scale, seems impossible to rebuild. The question cut to the heart of Sterling's survival prospects, whether any amount of reform and transparency could overcome the reputational damage created by systematic fraud at the highest levels of financial management. That's precisely why we're implementing the most comprehensive financial oversight system in the industry, Marcus replied, his response betraying careful preparation for this exact challenge. Independent verification of all financial reporting, real-time transparency of cash flows and operational metrics, and external audit protocols that exceed regulatory requirements. As he outlined these reforms in detail, I noticed movement at the back of the auditorium that seemed oddly coordinated. Several individuals in dark suits taking positions near exits and key aisles. Their presence might have been coincidental, but something about their positioning suggested official rather than casual interest in the proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen," came a new voice from the back of the room, amplified by a portable microphone that hadn't been part of the meeting's technical setup. "I'm Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's Corporate Fraud Division. This meeting is now under federal investigation. I need everyone to remain in their current positions while we execute search warrants for Sterling Industries' premises and records." The announcement transformed the shareholders' meeting into a crime scene, with federal agents moving efficiently through the auditorium to secure the facility while stunned attendees absorbed the reality that Sterling's crisis had escalated from corporate scandal to active criminal investigation. The fraud that Patricia had perpetrated with such sophistication had caught the attention of federal prosecutors who viewed it as potentially warranting serious prison sentences for all involved parties. Marcus Sterling, the man who had seemed in control just moments earlier, now faced the possibility that his life's work would be destroyed by criminal activity he claimed not to have authorized or known about. His famous composure was finally cracking under pressure that extended far beyond market forces or competitive challenges to encompass the potential destruction of everything he had spent decades building. The federal investigation transformed Sterling Industries from a prestigious technology company into a corporate crime scene within hours. FBI forensic accountants occupied the finance department, seizing computers and files while employees watched their workplace become the focus of what media outlets were already calling one of the most sophisticated accounting frauds in tech industry history. I found myself in an unexpected position as investigators sought to understand the operational realities behind Patricia's fictional financial presentations. My 8 years of managing Sterling's actual projects and client relationships provided crucial perspective on the company's legitimate business activities versus the fabricated revenue streams that had inflated reported earnings. "Mr. Davidson," Agent Chen addressed me during my third interview that week, "your operational reports consistently showed performance metrics that contradicted the financial department's revenue projections. Did you ever question these discrepancies directly?" The question touched on something that had troubled me for months: the growing gap between what I observed in day-to-day operations and what Patricia reported to the board and investors. Client satisfaction remained high. Project delivery stayed on schedule. But somehow, these positive indicators translated into financial performance that seemed almost too good to be true. I raised concerns informally with several colleagues, I admitted, consulting the notes I had been maintaining throughout the investigation. But Patricia's explanations seemed reasonable at the time. Timing differences between project completion and revenue recognition, currency fluctuations affecting international contracts, seasonal variations in client payment schedules. Agent Chen nodded, making notes on her tablet. "Did these explanations satisfy your concerns, or did you continue monitoring the discrepancies?" This was where the investigation became personally uncomfortable, acknowledging that my suspicions had grown stronger over time, but that I had failed to pursue them aggressively enough to uncover Patricia's criminal activity before it reached devastating proportions. "I began documenting inconsistencies more systematically about 6 months ago," I replied, providing the detailed records I had compiled. Not because I suspected fraud specifically, but because operational planning became increasingly difficult when financial projections didn't align with actual business conditions. My documentation proved valuable to investigators trying to establish a timeline for Patricia's escalating manipulation, but it also revealed how sophisticated her methods had become, creating explanations plausible enough to satisfy operational managers, while systematically deceiving auditors, board members, and regulatory agencies. "Your records suggest you were one of the few employees who maintained independent verification of operational performance," Agent Chen observed. "This attention to detail may have prevented even greater financial manipulation if Patricia had realized the extent of your monitoring. The possibility that my record-keeping had limited the scope of Patricia's fraud was both gratifying and disturbing, suggesting that more comprehensive internal oversight might have prevented the crisis entirely, while also raising questions about why such oversight hadn't been standard practice throughout the company. As the investigation progressed over subsequent weeks, The full extent of Patricia's criminal enterprise gradually emerged. She had created an elaborate network of fictional clients, false contracts, and manipulated expense reports that had hidden Sterling's actual financial condition while generating personal profits through kickbacks and inflated vendor payments. The sophistication of her scheme rivaled the most complex corporate frauds in recent history. Ms. Walsh faces potential prison sentences exceeding 20 years, Agent Chen informed me during our final interview. Her cooperation with the investigation could reduce that significantly, but the evidence suggests criminal activity that extended far beyond simple accounting errors to deliberate, systematic fraud designed to manipulate stock prices and investor decisions. Most shocking was the revelation that Patricia had been systematically selling Sterling stock short while publicly promoting its financial strength, essentially betting against the very company she was employed to manage, while creating the artificial conditions that would make her bets profitable. The personal trading profits from this scheme exceeded $3 million over 18 months. What happens to the company now? I asked, thinking of the thousands of employees whose jobs depended on Sterling's survival, despite the criminal activity that had compromised its financial foundation. That depends on several factors, Agent Chen replied diplomatically. The extent of operational viability once fraudulent elements are removed, the willingness of creditors and investors to support restructuring, and the effectiveness of the reforms Marcus Sterling is implementing to prevent recurrence. The survival question would be answered through market forces and regulatory decisions over the coming months, but the immediate challenge was maintaining operations while criminal prosecutions proceeded and public confidence remained shattered by revelations of systematic deception at the highest levels of corporate management. 6 months after the federal raids that had transformed our workplace into a crime scene, Sterling Industries emerged from bankruptcy protection with a dramatically restructured leadership team and business model. Marcus Sterling had survived both criminal investigation and shareholder lawsuits. His cooperation with federal prosecutors and implementation of unprecedented transparency measures earning grudging recognition that he had been manipulated rather than complicit in Patricia's fraud. The company that emerged from this crucible bore little resemblance to the previous Sterling Industries beyond its core technology capabilities and client relationships. Over half the workforce had been eliminated through restructuring, with survivors subjected to enhanced background checks and ethical compliance training. The luxurious headquarters had been sold to reduce debt, with operations relocated to more modest facilities that prioritized function over image. I had not only survived the transformation, but had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer, a role that combined my operational expertise with responsibility for implementing the internal controls designed to prevent future fraud. The position came with both substantial authority and the burden of rebuilding stakeholder confidence in Sterling's reformed management structure. The quarterly results show legitimate growth for the first time in 4 years, I reported to the reconstituted board, which now included several former federal prosecutors and corporate governance experts, appointed specifically to ensure regulatory compliance and ethical oversight. Revenue is down significantly from Patricia's artificial projections, but actual profitability has improved through operational efficiency and elimination of fraudulent expenses. This recovery, modest but genuine, represented validation of the core business strategy that had been obscured by Patricia's financial manipulation. Sterling's technology products and consulting services continued to generate value for clients. The fraud had involved how that value was reported rather than fundamental problems with business operations. Client retention has exceeded projections, I continued, displaying data that had surprised even our most optimistic internal forecasts. Major accounts like Blackstone Industries and Pacific Technologies have not only maintained their relationships, but have expanded their engagements based on increased confidence in our reformed governance structure. This client loyalty reflected something Patricia's focus on financial engineering had missed, that sustainable business success depended on delivering actual value rather than merely manipulating the appearance of performance. The operational excellence that had been obscured by fraudulent reporting was now the foundation for genuine recovery and growth. "What's the status of the criminal prosecutions?" asked board member David Kim, whose background in white-collar criminal defense provided valuable perspective on the legal challenges still unfolding. Patricia Walsh pleaded guilty to securities fraud, conspiracy and money laundering last month, I replied. consulting updates from our legal team. She received an 8-year sentence with restitution requirements that will continue long after her release. 2 subordinates who assisted in implementing the fraud received lesser sentences in exchange for cooperation. The conclusion of criminal proceedings had removed the uncertainty that had plagued Sterling's recovery efforts, allowing employees and clients to engage with confidence that the company's legal status was finally settled. Patricia's downfall had been complete. From respected CFO to federal prisoner, her professional reputation permanently destroyed by the very ambition that had driven her to criminal excess. And Marcus? Dr. Kim continued, addressing the question that remained sensitive despite Marcus's official exoneration by federal investigators. Marcus has been cleared of criminal liability but faces ongoing civil litigation from shareholders seeking damages for investment losses, I explained, referencing the complex legal landscape that would likely persist for years. However, his cooperation with investigations and implementation of reform measures has substantially reduced both potential penalties and reputational damage. This outcome, criminal charges avoided but civil consequences continuing, reflected the complex reality of executive accountability in corporate fraud cases. Marcus had been manipulated by Patricia's sophisticated deception, but his position as CEO created responsibilities that extended beyond criminal culpability to include moral and financial accountability for failures of oversight. As the board meeting concluded with approval of continued restructuring initiatives and expanded transparency measures, I reflected on the extraordinary year that had transformed Sterling Industries from fraudulent shell company to reformed organization operating according to principles of authentic performance rather than manipulated perception. The most significant change hadn't been structural or procedural, but cultural. A shift from celebrating artificial achievements to recognizing genuine operational excellence, from prioritizing appearance over substance, from accepting convenient explanations over demanding verifiable evidence. Patricia's downfall had created opportunity for values-based management that might ultimately make Sterling stronger than it had ever been during the peak of its fraudulent prosperity. The 1-year anniversary of Thompson's devastating audit presentation found me standing in Sterling Industries' new headquarters, a converted warehouse in Queens that prioritized functional workspace over Manhattan prestige. The contrast with our former glass tower couldn't have been more stark. Yet something about the honest functionality of our current environment felt more aligned with the company we were becoming than the elaborate facade we had previously maintained. Patricia Walsh had been released on early parole after serving 18 months. Her cooperation with ongoing investigations into corporate fraud networks having reduced her sentence substantially. I hadn't expected to see her again, which made her appearance in our lobby that morning all the more shocking. Security called immediately. Her presence violated the restraining order that prohibited contact with Sterling employees as part of her plea agreement. But before they could escort her from the building, she requested a brief conversation with me specifically, claiming to have information relevant to ongoing federal investigations. 5 minutes, I agreed, curiosity overriding caution as we met in the conference room under security supervision. What could you possibly have to tell me that hasn't already been covered in depositions and court proceedings? Patricia appeared dramatically changed from the polished executive who had once commanded boardroom attention. Prison had stripped away her corporate armor, revealing someone smaller and more fragile than her professional persona had suggested. Yet her eyes retained the sharp intelligence that had made her both valuable and dangerous during her tenure as CFO. "The fraud wasn't my idea," she began without preamble, her voice carrying desperation rather than the arrogance that had characterized her previous interactions. "I was approached by outside interests who provided both the methodology and the pressure to implement the financial manipulation." This claim of external coercion was new. Throughout her prosecution, Patricia had maintained that the fraud was her independent scheme motivated by personal greed and professional ambition. The suggestion that sophisticated criminal networks had been involved added dimensions to the case that federal investigators apparently hadn't previously considered. "What outside interests?" I asked, recognizing the potential significance of this revelation while remaining skeptical of claims that conveniently shifted responsibility away from her criminal choices. "Kozlov Financial Services," she replied, naming an investment firm I recognized from Sterling's international client list. They approached me 2 years before the fraud began, initially offering consulting fees for providing insights about Sterling's operational performance and strategic planning. This timeline predated the accounting manipulation by over a year, suggesting a longer-term strategy that had gradually escalated from legitimate information gathering to criminal conspiracy. The consulting relationship evolved into something more directed, Patricia continued, her voice dropping as if discussing state secrets rather than corporate crime. They wanted specific financial presentations that would inflate Sterling's apparent value while concealing operational challenges that made the company vulnerable to acquisition attempts. The revelation transformed my understanding of both Patricia's motivations and the broader context surrounding Sterling's near collapse. Rather than simple accounting fraud designed to improve personal compensation, her criminal activity had apparently been orchestrated to facilitate corporate takeover by foreign interests operating through sophisticated financial manipulation. Kozlov was positioning for a hostile acquisition, I asked, pieces of a larger conspiracy beginning to align in my mind. Not hostile. That would have attracted regulatory attention they wanted to avoid, Patricia explained. They were creating conditions where Sterling would appear stable and profitable while actually becoming financially vulnerable, allowing them to acquire controlling interest through seemingly legitimate market transactions. This strategic approach, using accounting fraud to disguise weakness while planning acquisition of the artificially weakened target, represented sophisticated corporate warfare that extended far beyond Patricia's individual criminal activity to encompass international business conspiracy. "Why are you telling me this now?" I pressed, suspicious of her motives for revealing information that would likely extend her legal jeopardy while potentially exposing additional criminal networks. "Because Kozlov is still active," she replied, her expression reflecting genuine fear rather than calculated positioning. "My arrest and prosecution disrupted their Sterling acquisition timeline, but they've simply shifted to other targets. The methodology I implemented, it's being replicated at companies across the technology sector." This warning suggested that Sterling's crisis had been merely one operation within a broader campaign of corporate infiltration and manipulation, with other companies potentially facing similar systematic fraud designed to facilitate foreign acquisition of American technology assets. "Agent Chen needs to hear this immediately," I said, reaching for my phone to contact the FBI investigator who had managed Sterling's case. "If what you're saying is accurate, this represents national security concerns that extend far beyond corporate fraud." Patricia nodded, her relief evident at having finally disclosed information she had apparently been carrying as a burden throughout her imprisonment. "I should have come forward sooner, but Kozlov made it clear that cooperation with investigations would have consequences that extended beyond legal penalties to personal safety." The implied threats added another layer of danger to what was already an extraordinary revelation. Patricia hadn't just been a corrupt CFO, but had been operating under coercion from criminal networks with resources and reach that made resistance seem impossible. As federal agents arrived to take Patricia into protective custody while they verified her claims and initiated investigation of the broader conspiracy she had described, I realized that Thompson's devastating audit presentation had uncovered only the beginning of a story that extended far beyond Sterling Industries to encompass systematic threats to American corporate security. The real numbers he had revealed that day weren't just evidence of Patricia's individual fraud, but potentially the first visible evidence of a sophisticated foreign operation designed to undermine and acquire American technology companies through financial manipulation and criminal conspiracy. 2 years after Patricia's confident announcement of stability had been shattered by Thompson's audit revelations, I stood before a congressional subcommittee as Sterling Industries' chief executive officer, testifying about corporate security measures and the sophisticated financial fraud schemes that had nearly destroyed our company. The journey from operations manager to CEO had been accelerated by circumstances no one could have anticipated, but the experience of rebuilding Sterling from the ground up had provided preparation no business school could have offered. Marcus Sterling had resigned 6 months earlier, his reputation rehabilitated, but his desire to continue leading the company he had built diminished by the stress and scrutiny of federal investigations. His departure had been voluntary and strategic, recognizing that Sterling's recovery required leadership unburdened by association with the previous crisis, however innocent his role had been in Patricia's criminal activity. The reforms we've implemented at Sterling Industries, I explained to the assembled senators, demonstrate that companies can not only survive sophisticated financial fraud, but can emerge stronger through transparency and accountability measures that exceed current regulatory requirements. The testimony was part of broader congressional hearings on corporate security and foreign interference in American business, investigations that had expanded dramatically following Patricia's revelations about Kozlov Financial Services and their systematic targeting of technology companies. Her cooperation had exposed a network of financial manipulation affecting dozens of corporations, with Sterling serving as the test case for recovery and reform. Your company's experience suggests that internal oversight mechanisms currently required by law are insufficient to detect sophisticated accounting fraud, observed Senator Williams, whose banking committee leadership made him particularly focused on financial regulatory adequacy. What additional measures would you recommend for protecting shareholders and employees from similar deception? The question allowed me to present the comprehensive governance framework we had developed through painful experience. Mandatory independent verification of financial reporting, rotating audit responsibilities to prevent capture, real-time transparency of cash flows and operational metrics, and most importantly, protection and rewards for employees who identified potential problems before they escalated to criminal fraud. The most effective prevention comes from creating organizational cultures where questioning financial presentations is encouraged rather than discouraged, I explained, thinking of the junior auditors whose concerns had been systematically suppressed during Patricia's tenure. This requires structural changes that empower employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation, and that reward accuracy over optimism in financial analysis. These principles had guided Sterling's recovery and had been adopted by other companies seeking to prevent similar infiltration by criminal networks operating through sophisticated financial manipulation. Our experience had become a case study in both vulnerability and resilience, demonstrating how quickly sophisticated fraud could destroy corporate value, while also showing how principled leadership could rebuild trust and operational capability. Ms. Walsh's cooperation with ongoing investigations has been essential to understanding the broader scope of these operations, I continued, updating the committee on Patricia's continuing assistance with federal prosecutors pursuing the Kozlov network. Her willingness to provide detailed information about recruitment methods, operational procedures, and target selection has enabled investigation of similar schemes affecting other American companies. Patricia's redemption through cooperation had been as dramatic as her fall through criminal activity, from federal prisoner to protected witness, whose information was helping dismantle international corporate crime networks. Her detailed knowledge of sophisticated accounting manipulation had made her invaluable to investigators, while her personal experience of coercion and threats had provided insight into how criminal organizations recruited and controlled corporate insiders. The most significant outcome of the Sterling crisis hadn't been any individual's rise or fall, but the systematic improvements in corporate governance and federal oversight that had emerged from our experience. The reforms we had pioneered under crisis conditions were being adopted industry-wide, while regulatory agencies had developed new capabilities for detecting and preventing the kind of sophisticated financial manipulation that had nearly destroyed our company. As I concluded my congressional testimony and prepared to return to Sterling's continued recovery operations, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with Patricia's false assurance of stability and Thompson's devastating correction of that narrative. The real numbers had indeed changed everything, not just for Sterling Industries, but for understanding how criminal networks could infiltrate and manipulate American businesses through exploitation of trust and regulatory gaps that most executives had never imagined could be weaponized. The boardroom where Patricia had announced our stability now served as a training center where other companies learned from our experience, while the reformed Sterling Industries operated according to transparency standards that had become the gold standard for corporate governance in the technology sector. The auditor's revelation of real numbers had destroyed comfortable illusions, but had ultimately created foundation for authentic stability based on genuine performance rather than financial fiction. That transformation, from manipulated appearance to verified reality, represented not just Sterling's recovery, but my own evolution from observer of corporate dynamics to leader responsible for ensuring such deception could never again threaten the organization and employees who depended on principled, honest management. The CFO's announcement of stability had been proven catastrophically false, but through the crisis that revelation triggered, we had built something more valuable than artificial prosperity. A company whose reported performance finally aligned with operational reality, whose leadership operated according to verified principles rather than maintained appearances, whose stability was genuine because it was earned through transparent achievement rather than sophisticated deception. If you enjoyed this tale of corporate fraud, unexpected heroes, and the triumph of truth over deception, please subscribe to my channel for more stories that expose the hidden machinations of power and the ordinary people who find extraordinary courage when circumstances demand it. In my next video, we'll explore another thrilling narrative where appearances deceive and the most devastating revelations come from the most unexpected sources. Until then, remember that in the world of high finance and corporate power, the most dangerous words are often "trust me," and the most valuable are "show me the real numbers."